and we'll get going here with the continuation of the afternoon festivities. My name's John Ehrlichman. I'm based here in Toronto, so I walked over today. It's a glorious day for everyone who's come to Toronto here in October. This is great weather for us, and it's been a pleasure to see some of you actually as a member of the media. I've interacted with some of you over the years, never so many in one place, kind of in this kind of dynamic, but then again, that's how we feel a lot of the times in the media these days, overmatched. But it's a pleasure to be with these wonderful panelists to talk about the subject of polarization, which, you know, it comes up every day. Certainly I can say in the work that I'm doing, and the challenges are very real and complicated longer term. So I think we're going to get a lot out of this conversation. I did want to, on the interactive front, I know there's been a great opportunity to get questions worked into a lot of the discussions today throughout the conversation, and so I'm going to encourage that again. I know that if you simply raise your hand while we're having the conversation, we'll be able to bring a mic around to you. Everybody over here can come and find you to do that, or we might get some questions online as well. It's a much better way to get some great insight from our wonderful panelists and to be part of the dialogue as opposed to waiting right till the end of the session. And I'm almost ready to go, but actually I wanted to start with a little bit of interactivity here. I was just curious if we could do sort of an informal poll. How many people in the room, maybe raise your hand, depending on whether it fits you. How many people here have oversight of, or at least some ownership of your organization's social media messaging, would you say? Okay, so we've got lots of influencers obviously here already. And how many of you also, on a personal level, use social media or, you know, have social media accounts? Okay, so we're cooking a lot here. And then my final question was, how many people have posted on social media today out of this group? Okay, still most of us. Well, this is good because, you know, I think that what's going to come up in this conversation, at least in part, is the role that things like social media play in polarization. And navigating those waters is tricky. And I often, you know, think of it in those terms just because sometimes it can feel like you have control when that is an always evolving process, and one where I personally think it's as if we've got a life jacket in these waters that are constantly moving and have played a big role in this polarization topic. Now to get to our great panelists, Ken Mehlman, who had a distinguished career in the campaigning world, knows the inner workings of Washington deeply, has had a successful business chapter now for years, which is still very much rooted in those interactions in the Washington framework, but also the business side and communications and a lot of the stakeholder issues that come up and have come up today, such as sustainability. It's great to have you, Ken, as part of this conversation. Matt Murray, it's great to have you as part of this conversation to talk somewhat like me with that journalist hat, and to provide a little bit of context on how the media are navigating through this world of polarization, but also I think we'll benefit from some case studies on the business front. And Patricia Audi, great to have you as well, all the way from Brazil. Thank you so much for being here with such an amazing NGO perspective in quite literally helping to teach a generation of politicians to be nonpartisan. It's pretty remarkable what your team has been building, and we're looking forward to sharing all of that. And so we're going to start with giving each of our speakers a chance to walk us through their perspective on this issue of polarization and beyond, and then we'll widen out the conversation, and we really welcome all of your views. Ken, I'm going to let you start, and maybe we can just start with this big question of how we got here in the first place.
Well, first, thanks for the opportunity, and thank you for inviting me to join you all today. A lot of friends in the room, and the work that you all do is unbelievably important. I know from the perspective of KKR and the companies we own, the chief communications officers are just so important to the value creation and protection. So how did we get here, and why are we where we are? I think about it as there's a lot of different components to it, but to me there are four very large phenomena that explain what's different today. But as I explain those phenomena, what's interesting is I would also note we've been here before as a country. So the first phenomenon is, what do industrial revolutions produce? Many talk about the fourth industrial revolution, the effect that digitization, that automation is having on our society, something that's been happening since the 90s, but certainly accelerating very recently. And what often industrial revolutions produce is a lot of people who are socially and politically unmoored and are alienated. We saw this in the United States in the late 1800s, when a society that was fundamentally an agricultural society became an industrial society. The people had worked previously with their families were now in cities where they didn't have the same connections. They weren't trained for the jobs that were available to them. There weren't the kind of protections that made sense. And so that economic and political alienation and social alienation that often accompanies industrial revolutions is one component of why we are where we are. Add on top of that, America is being remade, as it's been remade before. So if you look at periods where there's been very significant sustained migration into our country, again, look at America in the late 1800s, where you had a large population of Eastern Europeans, Southern Europeans coming to the country. It's often followed by periods where there's a populist reaction to it. We've had very significant migration, I think a very good thing for our country since the 1960s. Europe's had similarly those inputs. It's the result of lots of things: the aging of baby boomers, the need for more work, the fact that folks are coming and helping make our society a richer and better place, but it often produces a populist backlash, and some of what we're seeing today in the United States and Europe is that as well. Third, I would argue most importantly, what I call the Gutenberg II moment, the impact of social media and the impact of the internet. If Gutenberg I produced revolutions in politics and religion and elsewhere, because suddenly people knew what previously only sovereigns understood and they were angry, today people can produce what previously only broadcasters could produce. And the result is, in a world where everyone is a witness, a journalist, an activist, the externalities of every institution become exposed and people don't like what they see. And finally, the last component, which was not the case in the late 1800s, exactly as it is today, is the replacement of a world we had, at least in the early 90s, a world of benign globalization, and replace it with geopolitical rivalry. And the reason that's so important is because one component of the division we have today in the world is being driven, quite frankly, I think, by Russian and Chinese disinformation. And it's being driven all over the world. We drive the same thing in other nations by actors who are seeking to gain geopolitical advantage, as well as, if you're in your seat, a requirement that all of us think of where we stand in that environment. And so I think all of those factors weren't present in the early 90s, when America was the leader of the world, the undisputed leader of the world, when the effects of the political impacts of social media weren't present, when the remaking of American society wasn't as comprehensive as it is today, all of which is through social media, I think, weaponized, all of which is made more polarized through social media. And of course, a population that feels disenfranchised economically, socially, culturally, and politically is very good ground for that reaction.
That's really helpful context, and I think it'll set the stage for some good questions as we go through this. Matt, maybe just to continue on, and I guess your 10,000-foot view from the journalist's perspective.
Sure. And again, it's great to be here with all of you, and I appreciate the chance to be here. And Ken very cogently summarized macro factors very intelligently and thoughtfully, I think. So I'll try to illuminate a little bit of the journalistic slice of it, because journalism is so often in the middle of it and so often blamed for it. And I want to pick up particularly on one of Ken's 4 points, which I think is probably, to me, the most profound, and that's the technological one. And I think it's bigger than social media. We've talked a little about social media, but the influence of technology on how we relate to each other, how our brains work, what becomes news, what becomes events, what we see, has been so profound so quickly. And part of the problem is that society is racing to catch up to that, as are our brains. And I'm afraid it's going to take decades for that to happen. And I think you had a panel on AI this morning. I was the editor of the journal until last winter, and I've spent a lot of time with AI this year. AI is going to continue and accelerate that wave and to put the technological piece further ahead of us. And I think it's had a few effects. Look, I actually trace one of the moments of polarization back to pre-social media, when digital data became good enough for all of us to be able to identify members of the society very specifically by very specific traits. Actually, campaigns were among the first to adopt that technology. When you could atomize, which is perhaps a more incendiary term than I mean, but just as a descriptive term, people by characteristics, when you could cluster people, when you could target people, and when technology also allowed you to micro-target and bring them all kinds of things, a lot of things that were centralizing in the culture went away. We don't have a top 40 anymore. We don't have TV shows that we all watch anymore. You know, it used to be that the biggest TV show of the week in the United States would be 40 or 50 million people a week. Today, you know, you rarely crack what, 15 for even the best watched show. That's great if you're consumers like you guys. I probably all have. I have an iPad of different movies and TV shows and things I watch and books. I have more content that I know what to do with. And I'm marketed to very successfully and very well for what I want in my demographic. But once we could think demographically, that really transformed a lot of things that I think social media and the internet continue to build on and extend. And we have lost, to a certain extent, the unifying things that bring us together as a country, except we're kind of unified. And I realize in Canada I'm talking in an American context, but this is a Western problem. Except, you know, we're all unified a bit by being angry a lot. Now, there's good news in that. I think in the United States and Canada, the odd thing is that there's a lot of polarization, but I wouldn't call it a level of social unrest that's so terrible that compares to some past eras in American history. In a certain sense, people are angry all day, virtually online, and then they go out and have dinner and interact more or less peaceably in many parts of the country. And the United States has always been a volatile, complicated place, but I think there's a lot to worry about ways that we can be isolating groups, and you see it play out in every field. If you think about politics, you know, we're getting closer and closer to 51% or 49% candidates getting in with complications. It's much harder, I think, broadly thought, to put together a large winning coalition than it used to be. And then you think about the effects the technological change is having on industry everywhere, and that'll take me back to journalism. In my business, it's been a gigantic upheaval, obviously, in the last 30 years since I started, and particularly in the last 25 years. And part of what it is, Ken talked about it, is the democratization of information and the availability of widespread information for all of us, which in many ways is good, has eliminated all gatekeepers. I'm not going to say that back in the days of gatekeeping in journalism that we were pure and great and wonderful. There were problems with that system. But now there's multiple voices, multiple inputs, multiple entries, multiple data points, and multiple opinions. In the United States, there's 330 million separate opinions. And we don't have unifying or filtering voices that either will put those together or even broadly to react against in the same way that we once did. Journalism itself has learned some bad habits along the way as we've needed to stay into the business. So I think in many corners, not every corner, but in many corners, the profession has become a little more incendiary and hypish. We also use data. We also want eyeballs like everybody, and journalism too often leans into that. And you see that all the time. I mean, I can't believe, no matter what you think personally, that it's a gigantic national news story for so many news organizations that Taylor Swift is dating a football player and going to the football games. Huge story, everybody's covering it. And that's us needing eyeballs and people to come in. So that's another way that technology, I think, fosters some bad and unfortunate habits for us. So I'm interested in the technology piece particularly, John. That's a rich one, but there's a lot we can talk about on this.
Yeah. Well, and I also think, thank you, Matt. And I think those opening comments are a great segue into Patricia to talk about, you know, where we also see a unique political landscape in Brazil, but to perhaps shed light to this audience on quite literally helping to give training to a new generation of politicians who might not want to follow the same path? What would you say?
Well, thank you. Thank you for Paige, Daniel, Roger for having me here. It was a pleasure talking about as an NGO's initiative could help not to solve but contribute to reduce political polarization. Well, first of all, I'd like to give you an overview about the political polarization situation in Brazil. I think that's important. I don't know if you heard about Bolsonaro and Lula, but I think that to discuss the political situation in Brazil, we have to go back to 2008 financial crisis. Brazil was not affected initially by that time, but the effects could be felt years later. In 2020, in 2012, the first corruption investigations exploded, and also we had huge protests around all the cities in Brazil that addressing three things: a lack of representativity, what it means, the unions and the parties were not representing the population anymore, the quality of the public services, and also demanding government response about the cases of corruption. Then we had also some protests criticizing Dilma's government's overspending, and also we had Lula's trial investigation. Then in 2018, Bolsonaro appeared as a candidate that denied politics as the way to solve Brazilian problems. And he was elected, and we lived a four year of a far right government. We had the 2022 presidential elections in October last year, almost 1 year ago, and to figure how the country is divided, the difference between the two candidates was less than 1.8 percentage points. We also have our national insurrection in this January with attacks against the buildings of Supreme Court, the Congress, and also the presidential palace. And we have a new government that have to face what we are talking about, face all these problems. Well, then Renova, these NGOs, was founded in 2017 to try to address not only the political polarization, but also trying to improve the quality of the political debate in Brazil. It was founded by some business people who were concerned about the political debate. And in our first class, we had 137 students. Of those, 17 were elected to Congress and also to state level offices. And what was initially a crazy idea, wow, a school of politicians received a lot of support and even critics at that time. And in 2020 elections, the municipal one, we had 44,000 applicants to our course. And we have 2,000 graduates from those 150 53 were elected. In 2002 elections, we had 18 more graduates who were elected at national elections. So now we have an alumni of almost 2,100 students, and from those 175 are now holding terms, are holding office, and 407, more than 407, are occupying important positions at government branches around Brazil. So we can assure that 1/3 of alumni now are influencing the Brazilian citizens' life. And well, we are now have the recruitment process open, and we have only for 23 classes, almost 22,000 applicants. We will try to have to produce more until 24, the next municipal election. We are planning to produce more 3,000 graduates ready for running office. Well, what's the class content? We try to deal with all these challenges of the fourth revolution, and we try to address, for example, political polarization, try to teach them how to listen, how to speak, how to dialogue, critical thinking, communication on social media, political marketing, electoral, legislative, and also regulations. And in the early beginning, they learn how to dialogue at the classrooms. Our students came from 27 parties. We have in Brazil 33. So we have 27 parties in Brazil. They came from this. 56 of our students are Black or indigenous people, and 52 are women. So we try to address this kind of polarized world, teaching them how to build consensus at classroom, and it's working.
It's incredible. It's incredible, and obviously it tells us that in a world, particularly in politics, where things feel polarized, that there is a great desire within that reality of wanting to get back to something that feels normal.
I want to say on what Patricia's doing, one thing that occurs to me just listening to everybody too that is worth saying is something has changed in the world. People say this sometimes about where we find meaning, whether we find it in family or church or other places. And as some of those institutions have gone down, part of the problem is people find meaning in political identity and political parties, which social media reinforces. And so on all, this is not a partisan statement. Everybody infuses politics with far more meaning and identity and expectation than it should have. And that's clearly a big part of what's fueling some of the polarization.
I agree 100%. I mean, at heart, I think a lot of it is loneliness.
Yeah.
People have, so work, where you feel like work is core to what you do, and that work doesn't have to necessarily be what folks in this room do. People can have a sense of meaning out of work in lots of different contexts. When that's disrupted, there's a hole in your life. And we all have discussed, whether it's Generation Z or the millennial generation, when you're raised on social media, there's all kinds of data about the connections that we got growing up, the things we did growing up that people aren't doing anymore. And that becomes filled with social media, which is, as you noted, fantastic at exploiting addiction, rage, who's on your side, who's on the other side. Yeah. Loneliness is the heart of a lot of this.
And also, for politicians themselves, and this came up for anyone who's local, they might know with the former conservative leader who in Parliament basically talked about politicians chasing the algorithm and the temptation that exists out there Well, I mean, Ken, let me ask you. We weren't sure if we were going to see the government shut down, but I think that very fresh example highlights what some politicians can potentially do, quite literally the possibility of shutting down the government, and the fact that you have a dynamic that allows for an individual through their own online identity to have influence that feels different.
No question. So think about it. My favorite book of all time, biography about American politics, is Master of the Senate by Robert Caro, the story of Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson became a leader in Congress by working and engaging with his colleagues. And that was the key. That was how he got ahead. That's how he became effective. Barack Obama, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton got elected because they had an ability to communicate with everyone. If you look at who are the top fundraisers in Congress, what Matt Gaetz is doing is completely rational. He's getting ahead. He's becoming a national star. So is Marjorie Taylor Greene. So are a lot of other folks. So the reality is, if you really want to understand American politics today, the place to go is Vince McMahon. It's the World Wrestling Federation. It is essentially, think about it, watch that. It's faux fighting. It's faux outrage. But it's all about appealing to people's essentially sense of outrage or aggrievement for the person that they're cheering for, even if they're not really in a fight. People know they're not actually smashing chairs over people's heads, but the fact that they're appearing to do it, that's become core to the medium. And that is where a lot of our politics is today. And so the way you get ahead is by doing exactly what you're saying. It's not about fiscal responsibility, is not the goal here. People might say it is. The goal is to essentially give the finger to the system.
I just want to jump in and add, because I agree with everything there, but in a full bipartisan sense, if you want a sense of the power too that you have to shape your narrative in this social media world, because again, you don't need to have a gatekeeper or central identity, you just need to have enough people believe it. You could also look at the rather hilarious but disheartening fallout over Jamal Bowman pulling the fire alarm and being caught on camera pulling the fire alarm, because if you're following it today, this is not a partisan statement. He clearly pulled the fire alarm. He's putting out there a narrative about, oh, I thought I was opening the door. And a lot of people are coming in on the left to support him in that. And I bet not one of them believes it, but they believe it's important to shore up their side. And that behavior, so I just say that, again, not as a partisan statement, because this is the behavior that dominates our politics. And then we run in and write it, because people want to read about it. They either want to support him or they want to be mad about it. And that's a difficult cycle to get out of.
And it's another trend that accelerated. So we began seeing in the 90s the beginning of negative polarization. So you had politicians, the most successful politicians had an incredible adherence among their followers. And you began seeing negative polarization. Politicians that were great because they were basically able to cause you to be angry at, I'm protecting you against this guy. And negative polarization has increased massively, the exact way you're saying. And if you read the appeals, on both sides, read the fundraising appeals, watch the ads, on both sides, it's never about what we're going to do to make the country better. On either side, it's about we're saving you from fill in the blank.
I also notice a lot, and I want to hear how to fix it for Patricia, but I also notice a lot more and more in a disheartening way, the politicians are talking to their side. If you've watched the Republican debates, it's very much a conversation about Republicans, among Republicans, about Republicans and the right way for Republicans to be. I keep waiting for the politicians these days who are speaking to the whole part of the country, including the people who disagree with them, but they're fewer and fewer, I would say, out there, unfortunately, but sorry.
Yeah. Well, no, I think we should just get your perspective on some of those school lessons that are being discussed in the curriculum for navigating an environment like this, but wanting to not necessarily go down this road.
Well, I can give you some examples on how this is working. For example, I can think that in terms of, well, addressing some of our graduates that now are in the political arena in Brazil are now trying to not having this argues like I am trying to protect you against other sides. I really trying to build bridges. I really trying to build in consensus. One of them, who is now a senator in Brazil, is the one who is conducting the on fake news bill, for example. And other ones are leading, running congressional committees, trying to build consensus in such important Brazilian issues like, for example, health, education, and also trying to, and even AI regulation that we were talking about previously. Then, well, we can assure that maybe using this kind of solution, well, we are exporting this kind of solution also for other Latin America countries. For in last March, Costa Rica launched a similar organization inspired in our experience, and now we are trying to export this experience also to Colombia. That I think that, but it's a current organization that already exists and that is trying to export also experience. Now, what we are trying to do is spreading this experience to not listen anymore this kind of argument or excuses trying to protect one side from other, or trying to divide even more the countries and the families and even broken friendships.
Well, that's helpful context, and the reason I asked the question about social media off the top too was, Ken, if everybody's in this wrestling ring, I mean, even if it's the politicians who are the stars of the ring, everybody's connected to this world. So, I think for businesses that are trying to find the right path forward, and I think we've all seen the many examples of how businesses get tripped up, let's face it, by not being ready or by being too quiet or being too active. I mean, what are you supposed to do to navigate this world?
Look, I think that there's a number of components to it. I think at heart, the reason the chief communications officer role is so critical is because, in my opinion, communications is one tool that you have. But fundamentally, it's about engagement, it's about listening, and it's about what you do. So the toolkit that we try to use at KKR and that we advise companies we invest in is, it starts first by figuring out how your business model not only can provide the product or service you're offering, but can solve another problem in a society. We have something that we've now done at more than 30 companies where we provide employees outside of the C-suite with meaningful stock ownership in the business. And that really transforms how those companies operate. It reduces quit rate, it improves engagement, and it creates a group of people that are truly ambassadors to the company in question. It creates real value in that company. That's one thing. There's lots of things one can do. But how do you create value outside of just bottom line value that also adheres to the bottom line value? That's one thing. Second is really being honest with yourself. I think every company today has 3 licenses to operate you have to earn. The first is the obvious one, whatever jurisdiction you're operating in, the legal and regulatory requirements. But there's also a geopolitical license to operate, and there's a social license to operate. That social license, in my opinion, includes your supply chain. That's something you have to understand and engage on. How do you, in fact, engage with whether it's your customers, your employees, your key audiences? So if the wrestling ring is occurring, the way that you go from, which is how we all start, having the burden of proof on us, which every institution in society has today, the benefit of the doubt is someone knows you, right? So as crazy as our politics is, there are plenty of politicians who in fact are able to transcend that. And that's because people know them. So how do people who matter to you know your company? How do they know for what you stand? How do they know where you really are on issues? And I think it starts with those various tools I described. It's very important what you do, not what you say, how you're operating, making sure that you in fact have a set of core values that you live by and that you operate according to. And then some of those other tactics I think are also very important. But if you don't have a seat next to the CEO, then the company's not ready for what's coming, because this is mostly not about communications. Rather, it's about the business model, and does the business model align in a world where everything is being fly-specced? And the job of the chief communications officer is to pressure test that business model against those questions, and then figure out how you can actually use the business model to produce good outcomes, in my opinion.
No, that's very insightful. And Ken talked a little bit about ownership culture there, which maybe is a way to make everybody feel inside the organization like they're on the same team. But it occurs to me, too, that in a deeply polarized political world, that at the end of the day, most people who are within an organization have to get along. You don't have a wrestling ring at the office. If you do, it makes things even more complicated. So it's one of the few remaining places where the ability for everybody to get along and to forge ahead actually exists. So you've covered a lot of these companies that are trying to navigate this world as well. What have been some of your observations?
Yeah, I would even call it the imperative. I remember during, well, I think it was after across the United States, and protesters going to parks and tearing down statues. Companies under major pressure to take a stand on that issue. And I remember talking to a CEO who was New York based, who ran a big insurance company, and he said, well, I do have my views, but 40% of my employees are in Richmond and further south and southern cities. So almost anything I say is going to be a challenge to get it right. So they really are facing that situation, although as you say, John, they're also, the workplace is really the last place where we meet different people left in our society, and so it plays an important role. Ken, at the end of, I just want to pick up on one thing he said at the end, because I feel very strongly about this after covering companies for 30 years, and it's more true than it was when I started. If communications and the CCO role is not a central top advisor to a company, and the CEO and the CEO's team don't take it seriously, that may not be a good company to be at, because it is so central to what happens. And it's gotten more so. Partly we talked about technology and how that's changed things. I will express a little bit of sympathy for the politicians that we were just criticizing. The amount of scrutiny and attention that you get as a low-level congressperson today is unheard of historically compared to what you used to get. When Franklin Roosevelt was president at the end of World War II, so not really that long ago, he was getting treated for his heart disease, and he was basically off the grid for about a month, getting treated and going to Warm Springs. No president today can go, in either party, can go 5 minutes without being on camera, without being, whatever one makes of what Joe Biden is dealing with or not dealing with, cameras are there to capture it. Trump deals with that. CEOs deal with that. The risk of a gaffe, the attention, the scrutiny, the record, it's off the charts, and they're in very stressed jobs. So really mastering who you are, what you're about is important. From that comes having a very clear sense of mission. I think some companies have lost a little sense of what their mission is. And the mission, in most cases, is going to be to sell product X or to reach as many people as I can with product X. It doesn't mean there isn't a social component or can't be a social component. I can talk about that. But I think some companies have lost their way. And by the way, it's okay to say our mission is to, sell product X and make people's lives better. That's presumably why you're doing it. Business is almost shy about that sometimes these days. But I think you can feel companies sometimes grappling with how to describe the mission. There was a big fad in the 90s, too, of coming up with mission statements and principles and things you could carry around in your wallet. And that was nice, but there was a PR aspect of it. Given the scrutiny that everybody's under today, I feel you have to be very specific, very concrete, and mean it and live it. So vague platitudinous statements aren't going to work. And then you have to own it. That's where the social component can come in. Some companies have a very strong social mission. Patagonia is a good example of a company like that. They own it, they articulate it, they know what it is. I think a lot of companies have blundered into PR problems in the last few years because they haven't really understood their audience, really understood how to reach them and sell them, and really understood this media environment and been honest enough with themselves about what that means. I think a little of that is probably what, I obviously don't know, but probably what got Bud Light in some trouble, even if they had good intentions. So I think that the level of need to really understand how communication is working, really understand that and own the message, and this executives really buying into it and living it is just more important than ever. I suppose that might sound obvious. It's just
when to speak, when to perhaps not have that need to speak. I mean, how should one think about those moments when they do need to get involved and those moments when they don't?
The CCOs are talking. Well, I think I am a former CCO.
Yes.
I don't
yes.
know if you know.
Yes.
I was vice president of marketing, communication, sustainability of a large bank in Brazil. And well, considering not only this background, but also my experience as a public servant during more than 20 years, I could say that the global problems will not be solved by governments, only by governments, but have to be addressed by, I think that, an arrangement of NGOs, governments, companies, and individuals. And I think that in companies, the CCOs has, well, we are learning in the last 2 days the challenge and the new rules of CCOs. And well, I was wondering how important is the role of a CCO to trying to address this kind of problem as political polarization. First of all, well, I agree, fully agree with what Ken told us, but I like to add the CISO has the opportunity to assure that the right and the reliable information is reaching the decision makers, and also have the role to try to promote the dialogue, as we are teaching in our classes, trying to promote the dialogue and stimulating that people has difficult conversation inside organizations, because this is the only way to solve problems. If you have the capacity to listen to other point of view, even if this point of view has a different ideology, based on a different ideology, or even inspired in case of politicians or by a party. But what we are trying to teach during, well, there's a interesting exercise that one of our first classes, we split our class in 2, and we try and we simulate that the students could defend a different point of view, even though they don't believe in it. So this developed the skills of, well, what is behind this position, what he's trying to tell me, and what I could not even by now listen. And well, this is, I think that it's one important role in terms of internally speaking. But of course, we are also individuals and we are also citizens. And we also have a role as good citizens to not promote polarization in our families, and also in talking about our friends. Well, I travel with a very smart American guy, and he was telling me that, well, he broke a lot of friendships because political polarization, and the political polarization is splitting even families. And this is a phenomenon that is occurring, I think, that all around the world. And maybe we have the opportunity as individuals to also address this kind of situation.
I did want to see if there are any questions that are coming from the audience, just because we are starting to wind down. It's been a great conversation. I do see one right here, so we'll and then one back there. So we'll get going here. Thank you so much.
Hi. How do you talk about the concept of truth in your class, and how are people to understand that? As Ken talked about, you know, if we're approaching communications like everyone's in the WWE, we have to start with the basic premise that that's not true. So how do you teach that in your classes?
Oh, this is a wonderful question. Well, we stimulate that decisions are based on facts, evidence, and also science. So, of course, we cannot avoid the meaning of true, because this is complicated, because this is also based on emotional reasons, I think so. But we can try to reduce, stimulating them to base their own decisions on data and information. Of course, if they use this, they can have their own truth, because they have their values, they have their the decisions that they're the bills that they are voting.
Yes. Thank you for the question.
I run a program at the business school at Duke that's all about polarization and what business can do about it. And, you know, most business leaders agree that polarization is a major problem. As you said also, the office is one of the very few places these days where people actually experience diversity. You know, we all unfortunately tend to live in bubbles, and at least at work, even if it's on Zoom, you're very often dealing with people with different backgrounds and so forth. And then the third, you know, kind of observation is that a lot of research now suggests business is the most trusted institution, right? And by the way, I think institution is a tricky word. I think the research, I think, tends to suggest employees trust the people they work with as opposed to the institution.
You know, I've often heard, I don't know if this matches what you've heard, but on that I've often heard, I mean, business as a concept may not be trusted, but people trust their company and their employer pretty high.
Right. So you have all of these things. It's a big problem. Business is trusted. That's where there's diversity. But when you talk to CEOs and most business leaders, there's still a trepidation to take on what you could either call an opportunity or responsibility to do some kind of training, some recognition that you've got this diverse workforce. Business itself kind of models behavior where they try to find some sort of productive way forward. They do a lot of training. But when you suggest that perhaps there's a way to take advantage of that almost infrastructure to help solve this big problem that's not in business's best interest, much less society's, there's still a little reluctance, because I think they're scared if you get people in a room and you start talking about some of these sensitive social issues, it could blow up. It creates a lot of problems. We live in a cancel culture environment, as they kind of shy away. I don't know, maybe Ken, given your KKR experience, I know you have any either perspective or advice, or how do we kind of push the business community to do more?
Yeah, so I think it's a great point, and a couple of thoughts. So one, back to a point I made earlier, very important in my opinion is creating an environment where everyone in an organization, in this case in a company, feels common ownership of that company. In a world where the CEO is the big boss and she or he tells you what to do and everybody else are essentially pawns, in that world, you're not going to have that kind of common accountability. So how do you build accountability where everybody feels ownership of what they're doing? when you start with that and everyone then feels like they've contributed, there is a benefit of the doubt that they give to their colleagues and their employees. So it starts with how do you create a culture? At every one of our companies, we try to measure employee engagement. Corporate management is judged each year, and part of how they're compensated is based on how they're doing with respect to employee engagement. A tool we find to be very effective, I mentioned before, is this idea of giving employees outside of the C-suite meaningful ownership, typically the equivalent of 9 to 12 months of pay in addition to their pay. It's not a trade-off. Giving them real voice in the company and helping them understand what EBITDA is, how the company becomes productive. And we've done this across the board, starting in industrial companies. If people understand that, if a gentleman who works on the assembly line understands how a profit's made and how he can contribute to it, that creates that environment too. So once you start that and you create this common project that everyone's part of, I think you can take it to the next level. And you can say, let's find organizations in town, wherever the town is they operate, that we can work in and we can engage with and we can help. And we can put our business model to work to help that organization to grow and improve. And then something else we've done at KKR and some other companies is we've provided unconscious bias training. And the way we start unconscious bias training at KKR is we say, you know what your bias is? Your bias, we don't talk about it in terms of simply social issues. Your bias is you like big deals, and you like small deals, and you like tech deals, and you like industrial deals. And here's why that bias can make you less rigorous in looking at a particular deal. And so you start with something that's non-controversial, that is directly relevant to the workplace, and then you say, when you hire, who do you like to hire? You look to hire someone that's just like you, and what's the outcome that produces? So if you start by building a culture of real trust based on common interest, and then beyond that, you take it into other areas, in my experience, you can produce that outcome. But it does not start with the CEO making a proclamation, which makes people in the company like happy to see. It starts with them understanding they're owners of the company too. I'm a and then you give voice in the company too, and then you do things like unconscious bias training that starts with what it means in the workplace. And by the end of the day, understand, you know what? I always want to hire people like me, but in fact, someone who has a very different background is a good person to listen to also. That we have found to be effective.
I mean, we're pretty much out of time, but just as a follow-up to that, through that process, do you then find common alignment with other organizations? The question about if business is going to help to lead and help solve this issue, as you're going through that process, you find alignment with other organizations, and it's almost like there's a larger group that has more influence in this conversation?
You can, absolutely,
okay.
Depending on the group and depending on what they're focused on. But again, it gets back to it's not what you say. It's creating a sense of common destiny and then saying, how does it apply to what we're trying to do to create shareholder value that ultimately you can build into other areas too.
Okay. Well, this is a great conversation. I'm sure there's more questions, but thank you, everybody, for your questions and participation. And thank you, our panelists. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you.